Hello, hello, people. Okay, we'll give it a minute. I know a couple of people are joining live, and a few people will be watching the recording later. For those that are here right now, hello, welcome. And for those joining later, hello and welcome. So I'm just going to give it a minute just because I know I just opened this space, so we'll see who arrives. I'm going to share my screen. So here we go. I am going to, sorry, let me make sure I put it here. Try this again. There we go. Okay, welcome. So thank you for being here, whether you're joining live or you're watching this later. I appreciate you. For those who do not know me, I am Glenda Miles. I am a psychotherapist and a therapeutic yoga and meditation teacher. I guess the disclaimer I will put first and foremost here is that this webinar is for information use only. I hope that you will gain some insight, perhaps, with this incredible work that I'm going to share with you. But this is not a substitute for work with a mental health support or a doctor. If you are suffering from a mental health disorder, please seek professional support. And I will specifically speak to something later on as it relates to parts work and when I think it can be really helpful for many of us, just if you will, self-therapy, and at what point really we need to start working with a licensed psychotherapist or a mental health support person who is trained in IFS to be a support. There is a space to ask questions or to raise your hand to ask questions if as we move through this material, if you have any questions. I will leave time at the end as well. And if you don't want to ask questions here, but you have a burning question, please feel free to email me and I'm happy to provide you with any additional supports or information that I can. Okay, so let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. I want to go over what I'm hoping that at the end of this, you'll have some idea of what internal family systems or parts work is. So some of the key aspects of it, how parts can play a role in our anxiety. So from an anxious our anxious parts, what they are and how they might really influence how we're showing up in the world, and a practice to explore and discover our parts. So there'll actually be a couple of practices that are thrown in throughout this presentation. We will be here for an hour, maybe a little less, maybe a little, well, it won't be more. It'll be an hour at most. This is recorded, so at any point, if you're taking notes or you're going through something and you are like, oh, I wish I could go through that again, please note you will have access to the recording so you can review the material and the practices as well. Okay. Let's get started. So let's talk about what is parts work. So interchangeably, you will hear people refer to parts work and IFS. So IFS stands for Internal Family Systems. What does that mean? Think of it like the idea that internally we have all of these parts that create a system or a network that makes up who we are. This was created in the 80s by Richard Schwartz, who has a PhD, he's a clinical psychologist who, started in his own work as a family therapist, started to notice some things about his own clients. And so, as we think about this, he started to notice some things and really refined his ideas around this to become what is now known as IFS, or internal family systems. I will probably refer to it as parts work, because I think it just makes more sense for most people when they hear of parts work versus internal family systems. Just doesn't have the same ring to it, at least for me. So the goals of IFS, or parts work, is to liberate parts from the roles that they've been forced into playing so they can be who they've been designed to be. So there is a notion there are no bad parts. In fact, there is this lovely book, No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz. This is not, this is more accessible, if you will, for an everyday reader. Around IFS. So anybody who's interested, this is kind of the access point. So there's other books on parts that are maybe more technical for psychotherapists to learn about it. This is much more accessible. So in No Bad Parts, he talks about the fact that there is no bad parts, but there are bad roles that parts are forced to play. And I think we can probably all relate to this. So there's an assumption, if you're listening to this or here today, that you probably have been dealing with some form of anxiety, which is why you're here and having this conversation. And certainly we will get into that on the second half of this, but I want to lay the foundation for what IFS is. So the first one, we want to liberate parts from the roles that they're playing. We want to restore trust in self and self-leadership. And although we're going to talk a little bit about this today, this will definitely be in part 3, where we're really talking about self-leadership as I move through the 3-part webinar series around this. And the third is reharmonizing our inner system, right? Restabilizing, coming to some other place of harmony or homeostasis, and becoming more self-led in your interactions with the world. And that means really that we're showing up as our capital S self, when we're dealing in relationship, and it isn't our parts that are perhaps showing up, causing conflict and issues in our relationships to the world outside, as well as to other people, which we'll talk about primarily in the second webinar when we're talking about defensiveness and how do we really be more connected to other people. So that's the goal generally of internal family systems. And I think it's kind of really important to note here, and we'll talk about this in a moment, in a slide or two, that the reason that self is written that way, it's a capital S self. It's this part of us that's different than us referring to self as like myself, right? It is really this part of ourself. And again, I'm going to use maybe back up and say it's the self that is center, or often when we refer to a mindfulness, which I'll talk about in a moment, we refer to the observer. But let's take a moment, because there's some fundamental things that we have to agree to, or at least we have to agree to in the sense that this is part of parts work. And that it begins with the nature of the mind is to be subdivided into indeterminate, number of subpersonalities or parts. So there is an underlying agreement that all of us have parts. It isn't just those who are traumatized that have parts. And this is certainly different than dissociative identity disorder, or as it used to be called, multiple personality disorder. This is different than this, right? It's that the mind itself is subdivided. It has these voices, these parts of ourselves, right? It is self still, and we're still at oneness, if you will, but the mind has many parts to it. And so if we can start by going, okay, it is not a mono mind. There is not one mind, right? But many, in fact. We can start to understand how this might start to play out in terms of our parts work. In mindfulness, we start to create awareness of the nature of our thoughts, the stories, our behavior, right? Mindfulness asks us to be non-judgmentally aware of the present moment and what is happening in this moment right now. Okay, I notice sensations in my body. I notice maybe a thought or a story going on in the background. I notice perhaps some nervousness in my belly or the other things that might be going on for me, right? It's asking us to create awareness of it. And so we start to maybe notice as we become, we engage in mindful behavior or mindful meditation practices, that there's a difference between this voice and that, or this story, when this story comes up and that story, or this sensation is often attached to this emotion. And we start to notice more and more the patterns that start to show up. So when we think about, I'm just going to just realized that it wasn't in full screen, so I apologize for that. The self, I just talked about it being capital S self. So the first thing is that everyone has a self, and the self can and should lead the individual's internal system. In the ideal situation, our self, our capital S self, is central. It's observing, it's a compassionate witness within us that has access to inner wisdom, to love, to compassion, to guidance, right? And that is how we are living our life, is through this lens of this part of us, this self. And it is center. So it's a centering part of us. There are many words for this, okay? And depending upon your perspective, you might call this the soul. You might call this, from again, this mindfulness, we call it the witness or the observer stance. There are many words that you can put to it, higher power, our inner demon, if you will. We're going to use the word capital S self, okay? There's some things that we notice about the capital S self. From now, I'm just going to say self, is that there's some characteristics that we notice very common around the self. So the 8 C's in IFS, we call them compassion, curiosity, courage, clarity, connectedness, creativity, confidence, and calm. And if anybody has done work with me, one of the things that I use is a polyvagal lens. And polyvagal theory also speaks very much to all of these C words that are at the top of our ladder. When we're in ventral vagus, these, right, are often part of our character, our personality, our state of being. And so there's some commonality there with how our nervous system, right, is regulated and how we are able to access ourself. The 5 P's that go along with this, all those C's, is persistence, presence, patience, perspective, which is so important, and playfulness. That we have access to these qualities, if you will, when we're able to connect to and lead from or act from ourself. The essential self is who we really are. What's often called awakening or enlightenment is the embodied realization of that fact. So this is really important and speaks then to more spiritual aspects that, regardless of your religious background, right, might align with this idea of capital S self. What, in Buddhist terms, we might go to enlightenment, Christ consciousness, this idea of awakening, all really relate to this essential self and who we really are. This is a quote from this book. So in mindfulness, as I mentioned, we talk about this observer stance. Can we notice the trends and the patterns with that nature? Mindfulness asks us, of course, to be non-judgmental self-awareness. This begins to shift our relationship to self and then to the outer world. As I often say, the beautiful thing about mindfulness is when we start to create more interoception, which is our ability to kind of notice our inner world and to cultivate a relationship to our inner landscape. All of a sudden we start to shift also our relationship to other people and the world around us. All of a sudden everything starts to, the lens through which we're viewing things is changing, and therefore the world around us starts to shift. What used to be seen as threats everywhere, all of a sudden we see maybe moments of potential connection where we see more compassion for others because we've cultivated access to our own heart of, or seat of compassion within ourselves, our own heart space. And the same is true of IFS, which asks us then to not only become aware of, the thoughts, the sensations, but moving really more towards actively engaging with and building a relationship with the parts within us. Again, we're going back to the C word of being curious. When we can really engage with curiosity, the idea of what is going on within us. What is going on within us? Why? What am I feeling? And why am I feeling it? What's going on? Why is this external event triggering this response within me? As an example. So it's really, this is a lot of slides. I know some people like to have the information, therefore I put it here, but I will summarize it to say, when we're talking about IFS, obviously internal family systems, right? So it requires us to be thinking about things from a systems perspective. I also want to say I have nothing against diagnoses. I think for some people it can be liberating to have a name for something that they've been experiencing. For other people, it can be very limiting, and we know in the world that we live in, our diagnoses can be weaponized against us within systems that we engage, like, for instance, a healthcare system. The DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and it is a big manual that psychiatrists, doctors, psychologists, all of us use to diagnose people. And so part of the challenge is if it's not in the DSM, it's not getting diagnosed in the way, right? So, and often what we see in the DSM, as Richard will say, is a description, pardon me, of the different clusters of protectors that dominate people after they've been traumatized. So really what he's saying is, like, there's all of these symptoms, but the symptoms are really just different clusters of protectors that we're now saying, well, this means this, right? This is anxiety. This is PTSD. This is, borderline personality disorder. It's really just a cluster of protectors. And so maybe if we not go to the diagnosis, but instead look at these things from a different perspective, we can engage with them in a different way. And of course, all we want to do is to be able to recognize our parts and our ability to be whole again and to operate from this self-leadership perspective. Systems impact all of us, and how this system operates will put pressure, downward pressure, upon the parts, as well as the relationship we have between our parts, right? Now, systems can be large, like I just mentioned, the healthcare system, right? And they can be small. They can be a family unit, right? So they influence how we show up and the level of protection or safety that we feel. So coming back to this idea of our family of origin, or the family in which we grew up, is one of our first systems, and that establishes a baseline for our parts, for our relationship to the idea of safety, and our relationship to self and self-leadership. And this isn't to blame our family of origin. It is simply to say that that has a heavy influence, right, on how our parts develop and our relationship again to between the parts that we have and our ability to even recognize self. So for instance, when people have complex PTSD, which is really developmental trauma, right, childhood level trauma in their life, they often, not always, don't have a firm sense of self, this capital S self, right? They haven't actually developed it because often, as a result of the trauma, in particular in the family of origin, that self hasn't had the chance to fully develop. And so we see this later in life where parts then blend with the self and act out from that place. And really what we aim to do, and what I hope that you'll, start to at least see the potential for, is to establish a safe and loving inner system of relationship between self and all of your parts. Again, we all have parts, we all have a self. And so it's really about paying attention in a loving and compassionate way to our parts, but not necessarily indulging in the parts of us that are trying to be protective, but are actually causing harm as well. I love this quote. There is who we are, and the rest is what we've accumulated. And so often, in therapy, what we talk about is really the process of removing the layers and layers of protection that we've had to accumulate in order to live in the world. And some of us have had harder times in the world around us than others. And as a result, they have more layers of protection around them. And at the end of the day, there is still this idea that we all carry a sense of this idea of self, capital S self. So let's do a little quick exercise right now. Indulge me if you can. If you're in a place, obviously, if you're driving, please don't do this. If you're in a place where you can lay down, that would be great. If you're not, please just come to a comfortable seated position. Again, whatever that looks like for you today. All of this is an invitation. If anything feels like too much, simply come back into this present moment, into where we are today, okay? So you have an invitation to do a couple of things. If you feel comfortable closing your eyes, please do so. It really does help with interoception, or ability to go inward into our own body. If that does not feel accessible to you, then don't. What I do encourage, though, is to look away from the screen, to lower your gaze, and to really allow yourself to have your eyes, focus either on your own body, so looking downward, or to lower your gaze so that there's just a little bit of access point to your visual, so you can still be, grounded in where you are, but still allowing yourself to bring your attention inward. So this is an exercise that you can do at any time. It is a somatic awareness exercise. Awareness of our body. So getting as comfortable as possible, just begin to just check in with yourself. Perhaps there's any part of you that is kind of hesitant about doing so, or curious, or what's going on? What are we going to do? Perhaps there's some anxiety around what you're going to do. Please remind all of the parts of you that you are in charge. And at any time, if something doesn't feel okay, you are in complete control to step back. Is there anything that your parts might need from you in this moment? Allowing your awareness, once you're ready, to go wherever it's going to go. And notice where it goes. Does it go to your overall sense of your body? Does it go to an area perhaps of pain or discomfort that you're feeling? Perhaps it goes to a pleasant feeling in your body. Again, we want to be noticing without judgment or trying to change anything. We're simply being curious. What areas of your body seem to be easier to connect with than others? And you make a map of your body in your mind's eye, drawing out your body, either imaginary or real, of course, and indicating once you've kind of mapped out all of your body, noticing where you sense it more than others, where there might be, again, feelings of discomfort or tension. Noticing where you don't feel or notice anything. Perhaps the map of your body is incomplete, which is not at all unusual. Again, the aim in this right now is just to remain curious, non-judgmental. After you've kind of mapped out your body, I want you to choose one place in your body to focus on. Stay with the sensation for a moment and notice what happens over time with your awareness as you really allow yourself to focus on this one body part. As you notice the sensations, is there an accompanied feeling or emotion? Is there thoughts or story that comes to mind? How do you feel about this part of your body? Recognizing there is absolutely no right or wrong. And whenever you're ready, kind of coming back slowly. If your eyes are closed, I suggest you lower your chin to chest. And as you open your eyes, it's your body that you see first. Readjusting before lifting your chin up and coming back into this time in this space, into our conversation here. Be curious about what came up. Somatic awareness is such a really essential part, especially for people who have lived through trauma or are dealing with anxiety. Often our anxiety, right? We live really a lot in our head and not in our body. And so as we can start to map out our full body, we start to create more awareness of all the parts of our body and the deep, deep wisdom that is held here. And so I encourage you, right, every day to just go in for a moment or two, like we did, and just start to kind of map out. It's often, when we start to do this mapping exercise that we realize, oh, like I missed this whole part of my leg, that I'm not even feeling it really. Or, our toes, I'm not feeling them, or I'm not sensing into them. And then when we can bring that awareness in, we can start to actually bring that part of our body online. We start to notice our relationship to different parts of our body, whether pleasant or unpleasant, whether, it carries a story with it. Often it does, especially if we are holding trauma in our body, there's often a negative story, pardon me, that goes along with that. And so sometimes this is why it can be very challenging for some people who lived through trauma to be in their body. So if that is you, just know coming in and out, the pendulation of coming into and out of your body allows you to create more and more space and time in your body over time, right? It's like a lot of things. Avoidance is a strategy, a coping strategy that we deal with. And we'll talk about this because it's a thing that we do with anxiety in particular, is we try to avoid that unpleasantness. And what we want to do actually is lean into the unpleasant or the discomfort a little bit and start moving into and out of, right? Until that discomfort becomes way more tolerable, and to the point where then that sensation of discomfort actually dissipates. But we've been avoiding for so long, often the feelings or the emotional attachment that is held in our body around the experience that we had. Okay, so we're coming back to parts work now, which of course, somatic awareness is really a part of how we move through parts work. So there's different somatic experiencing or experiences that we move through as a really important part to even notice our parts. So there are two types of protectors. Protectors are the parts, right? And there's two types of them. There's also exiles. So there's protectors and exiles. We're not really going to deal with exiles in this conversation, but know that they are the wounded parts of us from child that carries the burden and the pain from that traumatic experience. And that is my note, that if you have that, that really should be worked on with a reputable therapist of some kind that's trained in doing so. But protectors are something that we all have, again, and that we can start to notice and to build a relationship with. And this is especially true as it relates to anxiety, which we'll get to in a minute here. So managers are protectors, and they are proactive. They have a strategic approach, right? They are all about, let me maintain control and order and predictability, right? To keep certain feelings at bay. I do not want to feel this way, therefore I'm going to do this. And I know by me doing this, for the most part, I'm going to kind of keep that at bay. And it really helps us to anticipate potentially emotional threats and aim to prevent them from occurring in the first place, right? This is worrying, right? All of the things that we do, the perfectionists, which is one of the examples that we're going to go through, right? So a great example of a manager related to anxiety is the perfectionist. They create rules, routines, strict standards, right? They're very rigid to avoid situations that might trigger distressing emotions. So managers are great, but for some people, those managers, man, they are working 24/7 all the time. They are overworked and underpaid for what they're doing, right? So going back, there are no bad parts. There's just bad roles that we're forcing these managers to play. And we need them to go on vacation, right? They are a manager who deserves a vacation, right? Or some time off. And so that's really the aim, is to let them ease up a bit, because they're just working really, really hard for us. Now, the second type of protector is the firefighter, and these are reactive defense mechanisms, right? These guys go in and they take the hose and they just spray anything and everything. Just get me out of here. I am feeling a certain way. It's like red alert. I'm feeling away. I don't want to feel this way. And this is when we engage in impulsive or distracting behaviors in an effort to stamp out feelings that have already been triggered. So we're already triggered. Now we're like, uh-oh, right? The firefighters rush in to kind of, pardon me, throw it out, right? They are fierce protective stance because they perceive an imminent threat to our emotional well-being. So even though another person might look at the situation and go, the threat level is a 1 out of 10, you might feel that threat as a 10 out of 10. And the firefighters coming in and acting accordingly. So there are many, many behaviors, as one can imagine, that relate to this. And we often do this without considering the long-term consequences of their action, right? This is when we look at it and we go, wow, the consequence here is this, but it doesn't matter because I'm going to do this in this moment because it's going to make me feel better, right? I'm going to engage in shopping, eating, certain foods, drugs, alcohol, whatever it is, right? Because it's going to make me feel better in this moment, even though it has long-term negative consequences to me. It's a defense mechanism. And what we want to do again is to make sure that the triggered response in these cases, right, don't have the same perceived threat internally. Okay, so let's get into anxiety and how it relates to this. So what is anxiety? Anxiety is a mental health condition and it's characterized by a whole bunch of things. One is about the apprehensiveness, right, about real or perceived threats, typically leading to avoidance behaviors. It can also include worry, rumination, distorted thinking, compulsive behavior, all of the things. As it relates to our nervous system, what we know anxiety is, it's a stimulation, pardon me, of our sympathetic nervous system, or that which mobilizes us. It gets us ready. I mean, often referred to as fight or flight response, which is very limiting in that, but it's an activation. So we talk often about the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals. And this is an accessing those, so it's engaging norepinephrine, epinephrine, cortisol, right? It's giving us energy in which to mobilize and to move us out of that threat situation. But and as a result of all of those hormone and neurotransmitters being released and the sympathetic nervous system being engaged, anxiety is often accompanied by a whole host of real physiological reactions in our body that have real consequences, right? Long term. These are not like something that we just make up in our head. This is a real physiological response. Our heart rate goes up, our breathing becomes shallow, muscle tension in our body, in particular our arms, our traps, our legs. We're preparing, our digestion slows down, our reproductive health slows down, all of these things in order to help us survive. Because for whatever reason, and there's a whole host of reasons, our brain is interpreting something as a threat or a potential threat. And again, as we just said, okay, if we're perceiving something as a threat, the managers are coming out to do their job, right? They're doing everything they can to kind of manage and to be proactive. And worst case, the firefighter comes in to do its part, which is, okay, we cannot feel this. We do not want to feel the discomfort of whatever we might be dealing with. In a lot of cases, it's like the uncertainty of what might happen. So there are 6 steps to the protectors. Again, the bottom 5 really relate to the exiles or the unburdening process with exiles. And again, today we're going to be more focused on the protectors, the firefighters, and the managers, not the exiles, which, as I mentioned, are the child parts that carry the burden or the pain of our past. Exiles should be worked with within a therapeutic setting because it can be quite challenging to do so. So these are the 6 steps: find, focus, flesh out, feel, befriend, fears. Again, the 8 C's, the 5 P's. Now we got the 6 F's. So when we're finding, the first part is finding. So we're going to find, right, which part we want to work with. And then we're going to localize the part in and around our body. So for instance, I want you to think about, I'm assuming that you have experienced some form of anxiety. When you're feeling anxious, where do you feel it in your body? Now, I've heard lots of answers to this question. Some people will say in their head, right? Because lots of thoughts and lots of rumination and ideas. Some people I've even heard in the hands, right? They get kind of a numbness and whatnot, or perhaps even fists. But most people feel it in their chest or somewhere around this, right? Maybe belly as well, right? That nervous energy, maybe upset stomach a little bit. There is no right or wrong answer to this, by the way. Wherever you feel it, you feel it. If you then start to focus by focusing the attention inward on the part, and usually, when we feel it in our body is one way access point to understanding the part. And we want to just be curious again, right? We want to cultivate this idea of curiosity. What is this part? What's the quality of it? What does it look like? What does it, feel like? Is there a quality to it, which means like hard, soft, hot, cold? These are qualities. So we want to focus on them and start to then flesh it out. We want to learn more about the part in a way that supports, again, this separation of self is having a conversation with the part. We're observing the part in our body. And the more that we can create this separation, the better. And then we're really feeling towards it. We're testing the presence of self. We're unblending from the part if necessary. And we're creating a relationship now between self and the part. And then we're starting to develop a friendship, right? We're befriending it. We're learning about it. What is its needs? What are the fears that it has, right? Why is it acting the way that it's acting? What does it need? Because often it's like, I've been working so hard to try and help you here, and you just keep doing X, Y, and Z, right? So we want to be able to understand it and to cultivate a relationship with it. And when we start to get into fears, this is where it might start to point to other things that are going on. Polarized parts, which means like really diverse or extreme versions, or exiles in particular. So let's talk about anxiety and the manager. So I mentioned the perfectionist, right? So the perfectionist manager, the primary intention is it's striving for flawless performance and control across various aspects of your life. It often sets extremely high standards and imposes rigid rules upon you, all in an effort to prevent any perceived imperfections or failure, right? A fear of failure, a fear of like not being good enough, right? Of not living up to someone else's expectation of us often. So you can start to see how someone like this, right? This manager works a lot. For people who have perfectionist tendencies, they are working so hard every day, day in, day out. Their thinking brain is constant, right? So does everybody with anxiety have a perfectionist manager? No, of course not. Not at all. But this gives you an idea of what a part might look like, a protective part, a protective manager part might look like for someone with anxiety. And again, we want to go into being curious about what's it trying to do? Well, it's trying to help us prevent any imperfections. So part of what we want to do, right, is really give them a break and go, you know what, it's okay if it's not quite 100% perfect, it's okay. Like, how can we start to shift some of those rules and ease up a little bit, right? High standards are great, but high standards need to also be realistic, right? They have to be optimized by the reality in which we're operating. And so context matters. Anybody who's worked with me has heard me say that, I'm sure. So an example of a firefighter might be as someone who's self-medicating. So a self-medicating firefighter, its primary function is to provide immediate relief from pain by seeking soothing and distractions from various means. Now, this can look like substance abuse, binge eating, gambling, porn, sexual activity, excessive spending. There is a host of, vices that are out there, but when we focus on the vice, right, we kind of miss this opportunity to really go, okay, you're doing this, but you're doing this because it's relieving some pain. So how do we actually allow access to the pain to subside the pain so that we don't have to avoid it? And it's all in an attempt, this firefighter is an attempt to numb our painful emotions and buffer the intrusion of traumatic memories. So when we have lived with a lot of painful things, we just push that to the side, right? We want to avoid, avoid, avoid. And so, and sometimes that avoidance, it's really hard to avoid. The pain kind of seeps in, especially when it's triggered. When we're triggered in that moment, we go to do whatever the thing is. And avoidance is definitely a big component of anxiety. We avoid because we don't want to feel the feelings of the uncertainty, of the anxiousness, of whatever we might be dealing with. So I want you to just consider for a moment, how does anxiety show up in your life? So I'll come back to this in a minute, that thought. How does it impact your day-to-day life? If anxiety is impacting your day-to-day life, you probably have some disordered habit around anxiety. So I know, I'm trying to think of who's on the call. So I know health anxiety is one of the things, so I wear an Oura ring, and it's great. And there's weeks that will go by where I take it off and I put it aside. Otherwise, I can become obsessed with my sleep scores. My husband will say, sleep is really important to me. And, it gives me a sleep score and tells me my readiness score based on my sleep. And if I don't if I'm not really aware and give myself that space, that can become very rigid in how I operate in my day-to-day life. See? So I would not consider myself an anxious person. I do not have an anxiety disorder, but anxiety is a normal part of everyday life. I can start to go, well, how am I going to deal with my day? I have a really busy day. How am I going to do that? Because I only got a 60 on my sleep score. You can start to see how these things can start to show up in your life. And so when we have anxiety, as an example, it can show up in different ways and become, I'm going to say, fixated or focused on different areas. For some people, that's social anxiety, right? Engaging with other people. For some people, it can be health related, and it starts to really focus on parts of their body. So when they start to feel the anxiety increase and their heart rate goes up, the heart rate starts to become another fixation. And then we have what we call this negative feedback loop. And you can see how the thoughts about the heart rate going up actually create the heart rate going up even more, right? Where do you feel this in your body? And how do you know it's anxiety? It's a curious question, right? Well, how do you know it's anxiety? Can you have a conversation with your body and the parts of your body, which might seem like a strange request of you, but I encourage you to kind of go with it a little bit, to let go again of this idea and just become curious, because our body, again, has way more wisdom in it than our head does. As amazing as our brain is, our brain really relies heavily on our body. 80% of the nerves are moved from the body to the brain, and only 20% of them go from the brain to the body. Our body is constantly sending information and signals to our brain. Our brain then interprets them, of course, but there's a lot of wisdom in our body. And so that somatic awareness, right, really helps us cultivate a deeper relationship with these parts of us. Okay, so some of you are my clients, so you have probably already done this if you have anxiety. Also, I'm going to see Inside Out 2 in a couple of hours with the little guy I look after. And this one, I don't know if you see it the same way, but it's on the right, is actually Anxiety from Inside Out 2. And the other one, I encourage people to kind of create a caricature of their anxious part, to name it, right? To kind of have this visual. It doesn't have to be funny. It can be like whatever it is, but it's like to create a visual representation of this part that lives within us. Why? Because it's easier often for our capital S self to build a relationship to someone that looks, internally different or has a name to it, right? We can start to dialogue with Anxiety Annie, right, in a different way when we have a name and it looks a certain way. So I really encourage people to go through that process. If you're not an artist, that's okay. You can use your imagination in some other way. Name it. What does it look like? What does it feel like? Where do you notice it in your body the most? And then when we start to get into relationship building, I'm going to make sure that you have this as a full handout. It's an amazing handout that talks about listening, which in relationship to other people is a great thing, which we all are. But also this goes to the relationship we have with ourselves as well. So I'm going to quickly go through this, but when we're listening, right, when we are in that deep self, right, and we're listening, we have awareness, we have presence. It's this attitude of I don't know mind, like about being curious and being open-minded, and we're in the observer stance. That's ultimately how we listen, both to ourselves internally, but to another person. Ideally, we're letting go of all assumptions and expectations of how the person should be. Ideally, we're being able to accurately reflect back what's being said. So we're paraphrasing back. I hear you saying this. We stay centered, clear, calm, and connected to to our own inner self, also to the other person. We're consistently bringing our attention back to the person when our mind wanders. Our mind will wander. Our mind will wander. We are a human. This is what happens, right? To expect it not to is to expect perfection from ourselves, which is futile, right? So it's just about bringing ourselves back, which is what we do in meditation. Why meditation practice is so lovely for helping us cultivate the skill of listening, because our mind wanders and we bring it back. Mind wanders, we bring it back. Meditation is the practice of recovery. We want to stay observant, noticing our body language and micro expressions, right? When we are paying attention to another person, remember that verbal communication is only a fraction of what's being communicated. And what we want to do is not be evaluating someone else's body language based on how we are feeling. So when we get triggered, the lens through which we're evaluating that is through our own triggers, and that's not necessarily a true reflection of what someone else is experiencing. And so the more calm we are, the more we're experiencing this person as they are, not how we are. And we're not needing to change anyone for me to be okay, right? And then there's all of these things on the outside, which is not listening, right? When we hijack the story and make it back to ourselves, when we're trying, being emotionally oblivious to the person's vulnerability, when we're minimizing or diminishing, where we're bringing something back to another situation, right? Instead of staying in the present moment. And I will give this all to you. So I wanted to go over a quick exercise in our final moments here. And that's to interview a protector. So you may want to do this. You may actually just want to sit for a moment. And as we go through it, to give you some idea of when I say befriend your part, you kind of go, well, kind of, what is that? And how do I do this? It's almost like you interview this protector. Again, it could be a manager, which are great ones to start with, by the way, right? Because they're not as reactive as our firefighters are. And we might want to start by saying, what's your job? And not or, what's your job and what's your role in the system? What do you do? Right? What is your job? How is it trying to help you? What kinds of things does it say to you, right? How do you notice? Remember, we talked about noticing or building awareness of the thoughts and the voice and the story, the sensations that come up as it relates to this person. How do you know, right? That character that we're building, how do you know when that part of you is engaged? What is his intention or hope for you? How long has it been doing this job? What is it like about the job? What is it not like about the job? What did it learn? When did it learn how to do the job? What was happening in your life that made it necessary? If it didn't do this role, what else would it rather be doing, or what else would it be doing? What would it like you to understand? If it didn't do its job, what is it afraid would happen to you? And what would be so bad about that? Now, there is a host of other questions you can ask. I will provide these questions, by the way, in a handout so that you can do this on your own and take some time and really cultivate that relationship. You might want to ask one or two questions and then go back another time and do it. You can kind of do that, but I will make sure that that's included in the documentation for you. So what I wanted to cover in this as we close up is I wanted you to have a sense of what this internal family system is, in particular, the parts, the protective parts, the managers, the firefighters, how our parts maybe play a role in our anxiety, and a couple of practices to begin to explore those 6 F's of find, right? Finding, let me go back to them here. Here. I'm going to actually do this one, right? Finding, focusing, fleshing out, feeling towards, befriending, then fears, right? So we start to build this relationship with our parts. And all of a sudden, when we start to have an understanding of who they are and what they want, we, capital S self, right, gets to kind of actually start to take on some of that and support them in the roles that we do. Now, think of us, right? We're the CEO of our company, of our body, of our experience. And so we need to take some leadership and have that self energy so that all of these parts aren't overworked and underpaid. Okay, so thank you for joining me. This was a very fast and very quick overview. I'm doing 2 more parts of these. The next one is parts defensiveness and creating more connection. It's really now talking more about our relationship to other people and when parts are triggered in each other and what tends to happen in these conflicts. And then the third part is the body-mind connection to self-leadership. It's really talking about our somatic experience and really how we can cultivate more self-leadership, that sense of self, and how we can lead from self. I hope that I'm going to stop the share for a moment so you can see me fully. I hope that you found this helpful. If anybody has any quick questions, by all means, you can put it in the chat. But as I mentioned, you are also more than welcome to email me. I will send the recording as well as the other documents tomorrow. So within 24 hours, you will receive that. And any questions that you have, you can email me then. And I hope you'll join me for the next couple as well. We'll get deeper into this as we move through these three. This one obviously was very much an overview of the parts work, but wanted to give people some idea of how they might be able to really cultivate a relationship with their anxious parts that can be more supportive to them and their overall health and well-being. Thank you so much for joining.